Welcome to World of Sleepcraft, where the rich lore of Azeroth becomes your gateway to peaceful rest. Tonight, settle into comfort as we journey through the shadows of Duskwood to tell the tale of one of World of Warcraft's most terrifying and memorable creatures. This is the complete story of Stitches, the abomination who has haunted the roads of Darkshire since the earliest days of the game. Let your breathing slow and your thoughts drift as we explore the dark forests and twisted paths that gave birth to this unholy creation. Allow the tale of mad necromancers and unwitting heroes, of darkness falling upon a once bright land, to carry you gently toward the shores of sleep. The story of Stitches is a story of transformation. It begins in a place of light and ends in a realm of shadow. It follows a man from kindness to madness, tracing the path that led him to create one of the most feared creatures in all of Azeroth. And it shows us how the choices of adventurers, made with the best of intentions, can have consequences they never imagined. This is also a story of community, of the people of Darkshire who refused to surrender to the darkness that surrounded them. They built walls and trained militias, established patrols, and maintained their civilization against impossible odds. In the face of horrors that would break most communities, they persevered. And it is a story of legacy, of how a single creature became one of the most recognizable figures in World of Warcraft's vast history. From the roads of a mid-level zone to the arenas of competitive gaming, Stitches has journeyed farther than his creator ever imagined. His shambling form has become a symbol of danger and nostalgia, feared and beloved in equal measure. So let us begin at the beginning, in a time before the darkness fell, when the land was still called by its original name, long before the shadows claimed the forest, long before the dead walked and the wolves howled with unnatural hunger. The land south of Stormwind was known by a different name. They called it Brightwood, and the name was well deserved. Sunlight streamed through the canopy of ancient trees, dappling the forest floor with patches of gold and green. Birds sang in the branches, and the streams ran clear and sweet through valleys carpeted with wildflowers. The people who lived in Brightwood were prosperous and content. They were farmers and craftsmen, woodcutters and hunters, living in harmony with the forest that surrounded them. Two towns served as the centers of civilization in this peaceful region: Grand Hamlet to the east and Raven Hill to the west. Grand Hamlet was the larger of the two settlements, a bustling community of several hundred souls who made their living from the land and the forest. The town square was home to a thriving market where farmers sold their produce and craftsmen displayed their wares. The tavern served excellent ale brewed from local hops, and the inn was always full of travelers making their way between Stormwind to the north and the distant lands to the south. The town was governed by a council of leading citizens, respected men and women who had proven their worth through years of service to the community. Among them was a family named Ebonlock, whose ancestors had been among the original settlers of Grand Hamlet. The Ebonlocks were known for their sense of duty and their dedication to the welfare of their neighbors, qualities that would prove essential in the dark times to come. Raven Hill to the west was a smaller but equally prosperous settlement. It sat upon a gentle rise overlooking the surrounding forest, its cemetery the final resting place for generations of Brightwood's dead. The people of Raven Hill took pride in maintaining their graveyard, keeping the stones clean and the grounds well tended. They believed that the dead deserved respect and that proper burial rites were essential to ensure that departed souls found peace. Among the residents of Raven Hill was a kindly alchemist whose potions and remedies were sought after throughout the region. He lived with his beloved wife in a comfortable cottage on the outskirts of town, spending his days gathering herbs from the forest and his evenings mixing elixirs that could cure everything from fever to heartache. The people of Raven Hill trusted him implicitly, and he was known throughout Brightwood as a gentle soul who would help anyone in need. The alchemist's wife was the center of his world. They had been married for many years, their love deepening with each passing season. She helped him in his work, cataloging ingredients and keeping their cottage clean and welcoming. When travelers came seeking remedies, she would offer them tea and a kind word while her husband mixed their medicines. The couple was childless, but they had each other, and that was enough. Life in Brightwood continued in this peaceful fashion for many years. The seasons turned, children grew to adulthood and had children of their own, and the forest remained green and welcoming. The people of Grand Hamlet and Raven Hill knew that they lived in a blessed land, protected by the light and watched over by the kingdom of Stormwind to the north. The harvest festivals were the highlight of the year in Brightwood. Farmers would bring their finest produce to Grand Hamlet, displaying pumpkins the size of carriage wheels and apples so red they seemed to glow. The tavern would open its doors wide, and music would fill the square as people danced and celebrated the bounty of the land. Children would play games in the streets, their laughter echoing through the forest. Winter brought its own pleasures. The forest would grow quiet beneath a blanket of snow, and the people would gather around their hearths to share stories and warm cider. The craftsmen would work on projects they had been saving for the cold months, creating furniture and tools and decorations that would be sold come spring. The close-knit community drew even closer during these times, neighbors helping neighbors through the hardest weather. Spring meant renewal, the forest bursting into bloom with flowers of every color. The streams would swell with snowmelt, running swift and clear through the valleys. Farmers would plant their fields with the optimism that comes from generations of successful harvests. Young couples would marry us in ceremonies beneath the ancient trees, beginning families that would continue the traditions of their parents and grandparents. Summer was the time of abundance, when the forest provided everything its people needed. Hunters brought home deer and boar, their smokehouses working overtime to preserve the meat. Gatherers collected herbs and berries, mushrooms and nuts. The days were long and the nights were warm, and it seemed that such golden times would never end. But such peace was not destined to last. Far to the east, in a tower called Karazhan that rose from the mountains of Deadwind Pass, events were unfolding that would change Brightwood forever. The Tower of Karazhan was home to Medivh, the guardian of Tirisfal. He was the most powerful mage on Azeroth, charged with protecting the world from demonic threats. But what few knew, what even Medivh himself did not fully understand, was that he had been corrupted before his birth. The dark titan Sargeras had placed a fragment of his spirit within the unborn guardian, and that fragment had grown along with Medivh, waiting for the moment when it could seize control. The line of guardians stretched back centuries, powerful mages chosen by the Council of Tirisfal to wield the combined magical might of the Order against demonic incursions. Each guardian was supposed to be a beacon of light, a protector of Azeroth against the darkness that lurked between worlds. Medivh's mother, Agwyn, had been the previous guardian, one of the most powerful in the history of the Order. But Agwyn had made a terrible mistake. In her arrogance, she had battled an avatar of Sargeras himself, believing she had destroyed the Dark Titan. In truth, Sargeras had allowed himself to be defeated, his spirit slipping into Agwyn's body to wait for the perfect moment to emerge. When Agwyn conceived a child with the human mage Nelis Aran, Sargeras transferred his essence to the unborn baby. From the moment of his birth, Medivh was two beings in one, the brilliant, talented mage who would become guardian of Tirisfal, and the dark presence of Sargeras lurking in his subconscious, manipulating his thoughts and actions. The corruption manifested slowly, beginning with minor eccentricities and growing into something far more terrible. Medivh's actions under Sargeras' influence were catastrophic. He opened the dark portal, allowing the orcs to invade Azeroth and beginning the first war that would devastate the kingdom of Stormwind. He manipulated events from the shadows, sowing chaos and destruction while maintaining his facade as a powerful but erratic mage. When Medivh's corruption was finally discovered, a small group of heroes ventured to Karazhan to confront him. Among them was Anduin Lothar, the last of the Arathi bloodline, and Khadgar, Medivh's own apprentice. In a battle that shook the very foundations of the tower, they managed to defeat the possessed guardian. Medivh fell, and with him died the most powerful wielder of arcane magic the world had ever known. But Medivh's death released energies that had been building for decades. The dark power that Sargeras had placed within him, the accumulated magic of the Guardian's own abilities, and the residual energies of Karazhan itself all exploded outward in a wave of corruption that spread across the surrounding lands. Deadwind Pass was instantly blighted, becoming a wasteland of twisted rock and lingering death. The very stones seemed to weep with malevolence, and nothing could grow there any more. The wind that blew through the pass carried whispers of madness, sounds that could drive those who listened too long to despair. The land had become a wound in the world, a place where the barrier between life and death had grown thin and permeable. But the corruption did not stop there. It flowed westward, like a tide of invisible poison, carried on winds that suddenly turned cold and bitter. The weather changed overnight, the warm breezes of Brightwood replaced by chill gusts that seemed to penetrate even the thickest clothing. It seeped into the soil, tainting the earth that had nurtured generations of farmers. It poisoned the streams, turning crystal waters murky and foul. It climbed the trees, strangling the sunlight and warping the branches into grotesque shapes. The corruption moved with a terrible patience, spreading a little further each day. At first, the people of Brightwood noticed only small changes. The milk turned sour more quickly. The bread developed mold overnight. Animals grew restless and aggressive, attacking their handlers without provocation. These were dismissed as isolated incidents, bad luck that would pass. But the signs grew more ominous. Cattle began dying in the fields, their bodies showing no signs of injury or disease. Crops withered in the ground despite ample rain and sunlight. Children reported seeing strange shadows in the forest, shapes that moved when nothing should be moving. The nights grew darker, the stars seeming somehow dimmer than before. Brightwood bore the brunt of this dark tide. Within days, the eternal sunshine that had given the forest its name began to fade. Clouds gathered overhead thick and gray, blocking out the sun and plunging the land into perpetual twilight. The clouds never seemed to move, forming a permanent ceiling over the forest that cast everything in shades of gray and brown. The birds fell silent, their songs replaced by an oppressive quiet that pressed upon the ears. The streams turned murky, their waters carrying a faint smell of decay. The wildflowers withered and died, their bright colors fading to brown as if autumn had come overnight. The people of Brightwood watched in horror as their home transformed around them. The forest that had sheltered them for generations now seemed to close in, its trees becoming twisted and menacing. Strange sounds echoed through the night, sounds that had never been heard before. And then, in the cemetery of Raven Hill, the dead began to stir. At first, it was just a few shambling corpses that rose from their graves and wandered aimlessly through the town. The people of Raven Hill were terrified but determined. They gathered what weapons they could find, torches and pitchforks, old swords kept as heirlooms, and confronted the walking dead. They destroyed them with fire and steel, hoping that the nightmare would end. But more kept rising. Each night brought new horrors, corpses clawing their way up through soil that had lain undisturbed for generations. Grandparents rose to attack grandchildren. Husbands turned on wives. The bonds of family and friendship meant nothing to the undead, who knew only hunger and rage. The people of Raven Hill fought bravely, but they were farmers and craftsmen, not warriors. They had no training for this kind of battle, no experience with enemies that felt no pain and feared no death. Casualties mounted as the defenders made mistakes, as exhaustion took its toll, as the sheer horror of fighting loved ones broke spirits that might otherwise have remained strong. Some families fled in the night, abandoning homes that had been in their families for generations. They took what they could carry and made the dangerous journey to Grand Hamlet, hoping to find safety in the larger town. Others refused to leave, determined to hold their ground or die trying. The community fractured under the strain, old friendships breaking apart as people made different choices about how to survive. The cemetery became a place of unspeakable horror. Fresh graves were dug daily for those who fell fighting the undead, but the diggers worked with the knowledge that these new graves might soon disgorge their contents as well. Some families chose cremation instead, burning their dead rather than risk having them rise as enemies. This practice, once considered disrespectful to the departed, became a grim necessity. Soon the cemetery was overrun with undead creatures that could not be controlled or contained. The survivors abandoned Raven Hill to its fate, retreating to Grand Hamlet and leaving behind everything they had built. The town that had stood for generations became a ghost town in truth, haunted by the restless dead who wandered its empty streets. The corruption spread to the wildlife as well. Wolves that had always avoided human settlements now prowled the roads with hungry eyes that gleamed in the darkness. Spiders grew to monstrous sizes, spinning webs across the forest paths that could trap an unwary traveler. And from somewhere deep in the woods came howls that were neither wolf nor human, sounds that spoke of creatures touched by a curse beyond understanding. The people of Brightwood gave their home a new name. They called it Duskwood for the endless twilight that now covered the land. The change in name reflected the change in their lives, the loss of everything they had known, and the beginning of a nightmare from which they might never awaken. Grand Hamlet was renamed as well. The people began calling it Darkshire, a name that acknowledged the darkness that had descended upon their community. But the citizens of Darkshire were not the sort to surrender to despair. They were the descendants of pioneers who had carved a home from the wilderness, and they would not abandon their town without a fight. The town council met in emergency session to discuss the crisis. They knew that they could not rely on help from Stormwind. The kingdom had its own problems in the aftermath of the First War, and the political situation was complicated by the mysterious disappearance of King Varian Wrynn. A woman named Lady Katrana Prester had gained influence at court, and under her guidance, Stormwind's troops were being withdrawn from the outlying regions. Duskwood would have to fend for itself. Lord Ello Ebenlock, the latest scion of the family that had helped found Grand Hamlet, took charge of the defense effort. He was a practical man, more concerned with results than with appearances, and he understood that Darkshire needed a dedicated force to protect its citizens. The normal peacekeeping arrangements were completely inadequate for dealing with walking corpses and giant spiders. Under Ebenlock's leadership, a new militia was formed. They called themselves the Night Watch, a name that reflected their eternal vigil against the darkness. The Night Watch was composed of volunteers, ordinary citizens who had the courage to stand against the horrors that now infested their homeland. They trained in combat, learning to fight the undead and the corrupted wildlife that threatened their community. The Night Watch established patrols along the roads, particularly the main thoroughfare that connected Darkshire to the outside world. This road was the lifeline of the community, the only route for trade and communication with the rest of the kingdom. Keeping it clear was essential to Darkshire's survival. The militia also worked to secure the town itself. They built barricades at key points, established watchposts at the entrances, and organized the civilian population into defense groups that could respond to threats. Every citizen who could hold a weapon was expected to do their part when danger arose. Commander Althea Ebenlock, Lord Ello's daughter, became one of the most prominent figures in the Night Watch. She was a fierce warrior, as dedicated to protecting Darkshire as her father was to governing it. Under her leadership, the militia became an effective fighting force, capable of responding to threats with speed and determination. But the Night Watch was always outnumbered, always struggling to contain dangers that seemed to multiply with each passing day. The undead continued to rise from the cemeteries, their numbers growing faster than the militia could destroy them. The Worgen, those half-human, half-wolf creatures that had appeared in the forest, attacked travelers on the roads and raided outlying farms. The corrupted wildlife killed livestock, and sometimes the farmers who tended them. The people of Darkshire learned to live with fear as a constant companion. They did not venture out after dark if they could avoid it, and even during the day they traveled in groups for safety. Children were kept close to home, warned never to stray into the forest that had once been their playground. The carefree life of Brightwood was just a memory, replaced by the grim reality of survival in a land that seemed determined to kill them. Visitors to Darkshire often remarked on the resilience of its people. Despite everything they had endured, the citizens maintained their community and their hope. The tavern still served ale, though the patrons spoke in hushed tones about the latest attacks. The market still operated, though the selection was limited and the prices high. Life went on, if not normally, then at least stubbornly. The Night Watch became a symbol of this resistance. Their distinctive uniforms, dark and practical, designed to blend into the eternal twilight, were a common sight on the roads and in the town. Each member wore the insignia of the militia with pride, a badge that marked them as guardians of a besieged community. Their presence was reassuring to the citizens, a reminder that someone was standing between them and the darkness. Many young men and women joined the militia, seeing it as the only way to make a difference in a world gone mad. The training of a Night Watch recruit was rigorous and comprehensive. New members learned to fight with sword and shield, to shoot crossbows with accuracy, and to move through the forest without making a sound. They studied the weaknesses of the undead, learning that severing the head was often more effective than piercing the heart, that fire could destroy what steel could not, and that some creatures were better avoided than engaged. Beyond combat training, recruits learned the geography of Duskwood in exhaustive detail. They memorized every path and trail, every clearing and landmark. They knew which areas were relatively safe and which were death traps. They could navigate the forest in complete darkness, guided by memory and the faint sounds of familiar places. This knowledge often meant the difference between life and death. The Night Watch also developed their own traditions and ceremonies. When a member fell in battle, they were buried with full honors, their weapon placed in their hands, and a watchlight set at their grave. The funeral services were brief but solemn, acknowledging the sacrifice of those who had given their lives to protect others. The names of the fallen were recorded in a book kept at the town hall, a memorial that grew longer with each passing year. Recruitment into the Night Watch was open to anyone willing to serve. Farmers' sons and merchants' daughters, former soldiers, and retired craftsmen all were welcome as long as they could fight and follow orders. The militia did not discriminate based on background or station, only on capability and courage. This egalitarian approach was unusual for the time, but necessary given the constant losses the Watch suffered. Lord Ebenlock governed Darkshire from the town hall, a sturdy building that served as both the center of administration and a refuge for civilians during attacks. He spent long hours meeting with the Night Watch commanders, reviewing patrol reports, and trying to allocate resources that were never sufficient. The burden of leadership weighed heavily on him, but he never showed doubt to his people. The town also maintained connections with the broader alliance, though these were tenuous at best. Messengers traveled to Stormwind with reports on the situation in Duskwood, though the response was usually disappointing. The kingdom promised aid that never arrived, sent advisors who offered little useful advice, and generally treated Darkshire as a minor problem in a world full of greater threats. This isolation forced the people of Darkshire to become self-sufficient. They learned to manufacture their own weapons and armor, to grow their own food in gardens protected by high walls, and to solve their own problems without outside help. This self-reliance would serve them well in the years to come, but it also bred a certain bitterness toward the central government that had abandoned them. The relationship between Darkshire and the other settlements in Duskwood was complicated. Raven Hill, the town to the west, had been even harder hit by the corruption than Darkshire. Many of its residents had fled or died in the early days of the catastrophe, and those who remained lived in constant fear of the undead that infested their cemetery. Communication between the two communities was difficult and dangerous, requiring travelers to brave roads that were never truly safe. The Night Watch did what it could to maintain contact with Raven Hill, but their resources were stretched thin. Most of the militia's efforts were focused on protecting Darkshire itself, leaving the western parts of Duskwood largely unpatrolled. This would have consequences in the years to come, particularly in the lonely shack where a mad alchemist plotted his revenge. The cemetery at Raven Hill became one of the most dangerous places in all of Duskwood. The dead rose there with alarming regularity, crawling from their graves to wander the broken streets of the abandoned town. Ghouls lurked in the shadows of ruined buildings, and specters drifted through the fog that perpetually shrouded the hill. Few dared to venture there, and those who did often did not return. Yet the cemetery held significance beyond its current dangers. Generations of Duskwood's families had buried their loved ones there, and some still felt the pull to visit the graves of parents and children, spouses and friends. The thought that their ancestors were rising as mindless undead was devastating, adding psychological trauma to the physical dangers of life in the corrupted forest. Tranquil Gardens Cemetery, closer to Darkshire, was in a similar state. The name had become bitterly ironic, as there was nothing tranquil about the shambling corpses and restless spirits that now inhabited the graveyard. The Night Watch maintained a stronger presence there, attempting to contain the undead threat, but they could never fully secure the site. The presence of so many undead in Duskwood created opportunities for those who trafficked in dark magic. Necromancers were drawn to the region, attracted by the ambient death energy that permeated the land. Most were destroyed by the Night Watch before they could cause serious harm, but some managed to establish themselves in hidden locations, conducting their terrible experiments away from prying eyes. The darkness that fell upon Duskwood brought many dangers, but perhaps none was as strange or as terrible as the curse of the Vorgan. These creatures were not native to the forest, nor were they created by the corruption from Karazhan. Their origin lay elsewhere, in a tragedy that began far from Duskwood, but would have profound consequences for its people. In the distant land of Kalimdor, a night elf priestess named Valinde Starsong had been given a sacred task. She was to use an artifact called the Scythe of Elune to summon warriors who could defend the Night Elf territories from the Burning Legion's demons. The Scythe was a powerful relic, capable of calling forth creatures from a shadowy realm beyond the mortal world. But the warriors that Valinde summoned were not what she expected. They were Worgen, beings that existed in a half-state between wolf and elf, creatures of savage hunger and barely controlled rage. The Worgen were actually night elves who had been transformed by the power of Goldrin, the wolf ancient, in an attempt to create powerful warriors. The transformation had given them great strength, but it had also driven them mad, and they had been banished to the Emerald Dream to contain their fury. Belinda's use of the scythe pulled these worgen back into the physical world, and she quickly lost control of them. The creatures ran wild, attacking everything in their path. Desperate to find a way to control them, or at least to understand what had gone wrong, Velinde traveled to the eastern kingdoms, carrying the scythe with her. Her journey brought her through Duskwood, a decision that would prove catastrophic. Somewhere in the forest, in a mine that would later be known as Roland's Doom, Velinde met her end. The exact circumstances of her death are unclear, but she was likely killed by a man named Varkas, who had his own dark purposes for the scythe. The scythe of Elune lay hidden in the abandoned mine for some time, its power dormant but not extinguished. Eventually, a man named Jitters discovered it. Jitters was a prospector, one of those desperate souls who ventured into the dangerous corners of Duskwood in search of valuable minerals. He found far more than he bargained for. When Jitters touched the scythe, its power activated once more. Worgen came pouring through from the Emerald Dream, savage creatures with no memory of their night elf origins and no desire except to hunt and kill. They fell upon Jitters' companions, tearing them apart in moments. Jitters himself barely escaped, fleeing the mine in terror and leaving the scythe behind. The worgen that emerged from Roland's Doom formed what came to be known as the Nightbane Pack. They spread through the forest, establishing territory and hunting anything that moved. The Night Watch, already stretched thin by the undead and other threats, now had to contend with these creatures as well. The worgen were different from the other dangers in Duskwood. They were intelligent, capable of planning and coordinating their attacks in ways that zombies and ghouls could never manage. They set ambushes, flanked their prey, and retreated when faced with superior force, only to return when conditions favored them. They were also fast and strong, able to outrun any human and tear through armor with their claws as if it were parchment. A single worgen could kill an armored warrior in seconds if it caught them off guard. The Night Watch learned to fear the howls that echoed through the forest at night, sounds that meant the Nightbane were on the hunt. The howls served multiple purposes for the worgen. They communicated information about prey location and pack position. They coordinated attacks, signaling when to close in and when to hold back. And they instilled terror in their victims, the primal fear of being hunted that could paralyze even the bravest warrior. The pack hierarchy of the Nightbane was complex and brutal. The strongest worgen led the pack, maintaining dominance through displays of power and occasional violence against challengers. Beneath the alpha were various ranks of hunters and scouts, each with their role in the pack's survival. The worgen who could not keep up, who were too weak or too slow, were driven out to survive alone or die. Some of these outcast worgen became particularly dangerous. Separated from the pack's structure, they grew more desperate and reckless. They would attack targets that the pack would avoid, taking risks that often ended in their deaths, but sometimes resulted in successful kills. The Night Watch actually feared these lone worgen more than the organized packs, as their behavior was unpredictable. The Nightbane established dens throughout the forest, caves and hollows where they rested during the day and raised their young. Yes, the worgen bred, passing on their curse to offspring that knew nothing but the bestial life. These young worgen were particularly savage, having never known any existence other than the hunt. The Night Watch made efforts to locate and destroy these dens, with mixed success. Some of the worgen retained fragments of their humanity, enough to feel the horror of what they had become. These tortured souls haunted the forest in a different way, seeking release from a curse they could not escape. Their existence raised difficult questions about mercy and justice, questions that had no easy answers. The citizens of Darkshire told stories about the worgen, tales that grew more frightening with each retelling. Parents warned their children to never go into the forest alone, to always stay within sight of the town walls. Farmers reinforced their homes and kept weapons close at hand. The worgen became part of the nightmare that Duskwood had become, another layer of fear in a place that seemed made of nothing else. The Night Watch developed tactics for dealing with the worgen, though these were only partially effective. They learned that silver weapons were more effective than ordinary steel, though the reasons for this were unclear. They discovered that fire could drive the creatures back, at least temporarily. But they could not eliminate the Nightbane, only contain them enough to keep the roads marginally safe. Jitters, the man whose actions had unleashed the worgen, was consumed by guilt for what he had done. He survived in the shadows of Duskwood, hiding from both the creatures he had summoned and the people who might blame him for the disaster. His knowledge of the scythe of Elune would eventually prove valuable, but for years he kept silent, too afraid to reveal his role in the tragedy. The worgen problem would not be fully addressed until after the cataclysm, when the Gilnean worgen took an interest in their feral cousins. But that was far in the future. In the early days of Duskwood's darkness, the Nightbane were simply another threat to be survived, another reason to fear the forest that had once been home. The interaction between the various threats in Duskwood created a complex ecosystem of danger. The undead and the worgen sometimes fought each other, their territories overlapping in ways that led to conflict. The giant spiders preyed on anything that wandered into their webs, whether it was a living human or a shambling corpse. The darkness had created a hierarchy of predators, with the people of Darkshire at the bottom. This layering of threats made Duskwood feel like a genuinely dangerous place. Unlike some zones where dangers were clearly delineated and easily avoided, Duskwood offered no safe paths. Every road might hold an ambush, every clearing might contain a threat. The constant vigilance required to survive in such an environment wore on the inhabitants, contributing to the grim determination that defined them. Travelers who passed through Duskwood often spoke of the oppressive atmosphere. It was not just the darkness or the dangers, but the cumulative weight of despair that seemed to hang in the air. The land itself felt wounded, corrupted in ways that went beyond simple magical pollution. Some theorists suggested that the barrier between the physical world and the realm of death had been permanently weakened, that Duskwood was becoming a bridge between life and death. This spiritual corruption manifested in subtle ways. Food grown in Duskwood had a bitter taste that no amount of preparation could eliminate. Animals born there were smaller and weaker than their counterparts elsewhere. Dreams were darker in Duskwood, the sleeping mind more easily touched by nightmare. The corruption from Karazhan had infected everything, poisoning the land and its people at levels too deep to measure. While the people of Darkshire struggled against the darkness, Another tragedy was unfolding in the shadows of Raven Hill. The kindly alchemist, who had been so beloved by his neighbors, was about to become something far different, something that would eventually spawn one of the most terrifying creatures in all of Duskwood. To understand what Abercrombie became, we must first understand what he was. Before the darkness fell, before the corruption spread from Karazhan to poison the land, Abercrombie was one of the most respected men in all of Brightwood. His skill with potions and remedies was legendary, and people would travel for miles to seek his help. Abercrombie had learned his craft from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. The family had been healers for generations, passing down recipes and techniques that had been refined over centuries. Abercrombie had added to this knowledge with his own research, developing new treatments and improving existing ones. His workroom was filled with books and scrolls, with jars of ingredients and racks of equipment. The people of Raven Hill often came to Abercrombie for help with ailments that the local priests could not cure. He never turned anyone away, even when they could not pay. For the poor, he would simply ask for a favor in return, a bit of labor or a delivery of firewood. He believed that healing was a calling, not a business, and that refusing help to those in need would be a betrayal of everything his family had stood for. Abercrombie's reputation extended beyond Raven Hill to Grand Hamlet and even to Stormwind itself. Occasionally, messengers would arrive from the capital, bearing requests for specific potions or consultations on difficult cases. Abercrombie always complied, though he preferred the quiet life of his village to the bustle of the city. The alchemist's name was Abercrombie, and his descent into madness began with love. His wife, Eliza, was everything to him. She was his companion, his helper, his reason for living. When she fell ill, he devoted every resource to saving her. He tried every remedy in his considerable repertoire, consulted every text in his library, and prayed to every power he could name. But Eliza's illness was beyond his skill to cure. Day by day he watched her fade, her strength failing and her light dimming. When she finally passed, something broke inside Abercrombie. The kindly alchemist who had helped so many people could not accept that he had been unable to save the one person who mattered most. In his grief and desperation, Abercrombie turned to forbidden knowledge. He had always avoided the darker aspects of alchemy, the practices that dealt with death and undeath. But now, with Eliza gone, those restrictions seemed meaningless. He began to study necromancy, the magic of death and resurrection. The corruption that had transformed Brightwood into Duskwood actually aided Abercrombie's research. The dark energies that permeated the land made necromantic rituals easier to perform, their effects more powerful. The walking dead in the cemetery provided subjects for experimentation. Abercrombie's cottage, once a place of healing, became a workshop of horror. His research led him to an ancient and terrible ritual. It was said that a person could restore life to the dead by sacrificing their own heart, placing the still beating organ within the corpse. The life force contained in the heart would reanimate the body, bringing the dead back to a semblance of life. Abercrombie did not hesitate. He dug up Eliza's grave, recovered her body, and performed the ritual. Using his alchemical knowledge to keep himself alive without a heart, he placed the organ within his dead wife's chest. Dark magic flowed through the connection, and Eliza's eyes opened once more. But the woman who woke was not the wife Abercrombie remembered. The ritual had restored her body, but it had also cursed her with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. She was a ghoul now, a creature of endless appetite and diminished reason. The love she had felt for her husband was gone, replaced by a bestial need that could never be satisfied. Abercrombie was devastated, but he could not bring himself to destroy what remained of his wife. Instead, he reburied her in the cemetery, keeping her grave marked so he could visit and leave offerings. He hoped that somehow, someday, he might find a way to restore her fully, to bring back the woman she had been. The experience drove Abercrombie completely mad. His grief transformed into rage, rage at a world that had taken his wife, rage at the powers of light that had failed to save her, rage at the people of Duskwood who continued their miserable lives while Eliza rotted in the ground. He began to plot revenge against everyone and everything. The transformation of Abercrombie's personality was gradual but complete. Where once he had spent his days helping others, now he spent them brooding over his failures and nurturing his hatred. Where once he had looked upon his neighbors with kindness, now he saw only people who had not suffered as he had suffered, who dared to be happy when his world had been destroyed. His sleep, when it came at all, was filled with nightmares. He would see Eliza as she had been in life, beautiful and loving, only to watch her decay before his eyes. He would reach for her, but she would crumble to dust in his arms. He would wake screaming alone in his cottage, surrounded by the tools of his failures. The cottage itself began to reflect his deteriorating mental state. Where once it had been clean and organized, a proper workshop for a respected alchemist, now it descended into chaos. Jars of failed experiments cluttered every surface. Books lay open to pages of forbidden knowledge. The smell of decay permeated everything, the scent of ingredients that should never have been combined. Abercrombie's appearance changed as well. He stopped caring for himself, letting his hair grow wild and his clothes become ragged. His eyes, once bright with intelligence and compassion, became hollow and distant. Visitors who came seeking remedies found not the helpful alchemist they remembered, but a shell of a man who barely acknowledged their presence. Gradually, the visitors stopped coming. Word spread that the alchemist of Raven Hill was no longer reliable, that his potions were as likely to poison as to heal. People found other sources for their medicines, and Abercrombie was left alone with his grief and his growing madness. Abercrombie moved to a small shack outside the Raven Hill Cemetery, abandoning the cottage where he and Eliza had lived together. He could not bear to remain in the place where they had been happy, surrounded by memories of a life that was gone forever. The shack was crude and uncomfortable, but it was close to Eliza's grave, and that was all that mattered to him now. Living as a hermit, Abercrombie continued his necromantic research with single-minded obsession. He learned to create undead servants, to bind spirits to his will, to perform dark rituals that would have horrified his former self. The kindly alchemist was gone, replaced by a creature known as the Embalmer. The people of Duskwood began to tell stories about the Embalmer, tales meant to frighten children into obedience. In these stories, the Embalmer was a boogeyman who would take bad children and turn them into undead servants. The name became a byword for evil, though few realized that the legend was based on a real person living in their midst. Abercrombie cultivated his reputation as a harmless hermit, an old man living alone in a shack who occasionally came to town for supplies. When visitors came to his door, he acted confused and feeble, a pitiable figure who needed help rather than a dangerous necromancer plotting terrible things. His disguise was perfect, and no one suspected the truth. The Night Watch occasionally checked on Abercrombie, but their inspections were cursory. An old man living alone near the cemetery was hardly a priority when werewolves and zombies were attacking the roads. Abercrombie answered their questions politely, offered them tea, and watched them leave with a smile that concealed his contempt. In the darkness of his shack, surrounded by the tools of his terrible trade, Abercrombie began his greatest work. He would create an abomination, a creature sewn together from the parts of many corpses, animated by dark magic and driven by a single purpose. This abomination would be his revenge on the people of Duskwood, his gift to the mayor of Darkshire who represented everything Abercrombie had come to hate. The creation would take time and resources that Abercrombie did not have. Years of preparation would be required, gathering the right corpses, preserving them against decay, acquiring the rare components that would bind them together. He would need space to work, tools that most men would never touch, and knowledge that came only from the darkest corners of necromantic lore. Abercrombie had access to most of this through his proximity to the cemetery. Fresh bodies were delivered regularly as the people of Duskwood continued to die from the various threats that plagued them. The necromancer would visit the graves at night, selecting the best specimens and spiriting them away to his shack. He was patient, waiting for exactly the right bodies to become available. The strongest warriors who fell in battle against the undead, Abercrombie claimed them. The largest farmers who succumbed to disease or accident, Abercrombie claimed them too. He was building his creature from the finest raw materials available, rejecting anything that did not meet his exacting standards. The preservation techniques he developed would have made him famous in legitimate circles. He created alchemical solutions that halted decay indefinitely, allowing him to stockpile body parts until he had everything he needed. His shack contained a macabre collection, limbs and torsos and heads arranged in careful rows, each one waiting for the moment it would be joined to the whole. But for all his preparations, Abercrombie still lacked certain crucial components. The binding rituals required materials he could not obtain locally, substances and artifacts that would have to come from elsewhere. He would need help, unwitting accomplices who would gather these materials without understanding their purpose. He began to plan his deception, his mad mind working through every detail of his scheme. He would present himself as a harmless hermit, an old man living alone who needed help with simple tasks. Adventurers would come, as they always did in troubled lands, and he would send them on errands that seemed innocent but served his dark purposes. Each component had to be acquired in the right sequence. Some required others to be gathered first, creating a chain of dependencies that Abercrombie mapped out in his mind. He rehearsed the stories he would tell, the lies that would convince heroes to help him. He perfected his disguise, the trembling hands and quavering voice that would make him seem pitiable rather than dangerous. And so the stage was set for the creation of Stitches. Abercrombie's plan was deviously simple. He would present himself as a harmless old man in need of assistance, and well meaning adventurers would help him gather the components he needed. Each errand would seem innocent enough on its own, but together they would provide everything necessary to create his unholy masterpiece. The chain of deception began in Darkshire itself with a woman named Madame Eva. She was a kind soul who worried about her neighbors, even those who lived on the fringes of society. She had noticed that the old hermit who used to come to town for supplies had not been seen in some time, and she was concerned for his welfare. When adventurers came through Darkshire, as they often did in those dangerous times, Madame Eva would ask them to check on the hermit. It seemed like a simple enough task, a brief detour to make sure an elderly man was safe. The adventurers agreed, never suspecting that they were about to become pawns in a necromancer's game. The road to Abercrombie's shack led through some of the most dangerous territory in Duskwood. Undead roamed the paths near Raven Hill, and the cemetery itself was overrun with walking corpses. Simply reaching the hermit was a test of skill and courage. When the adventurers finally arrived at the shack overlooking the cemetery, they found exactly what they expected: a frail old man struggling to survive alone. Abercrombie played his role perfectly, shuffling around his humble home and speaking in a quavering voice. He thanked the adventurers profusely for checking on him and explained that his age made it difficult to make the journey to town anymore. Then came the first request. Abercrombie explained that the nights were cold and he needed some ghost hair thread to make warm clothing. He asked the adventurers to return to Darkshire and obtain some from Madame Eva. The request seemed innocent enough. Ghost hair thread was an unusual material, to be sure, but it was used in various magical crafts. The adventurers returned to Madame Eva, only to discover that she had none in stock. She directed them to Blind Mary, a specter who haunted a cottage on the outskirts of town. Blind Mary was a tragic figure, a ghost trapped between worlds who could not find rest. She would provide ghost hair thread if someone would help her, specifically by using a spectral comb to brush her hair. The task was eerie but not dangerous, and the adventurers completed it without incident. They returned the ghost hair thread to Abercrombie, who thanked them effusively, but he had another request. The nights were not only cold, but lonely, and a drink called zombie juice would help warm his old bones. Could the adventurers obtain some from the tavern in Darkshire? Back in town, the adventurers learned from Tavern Keep Smith's that zombie juice was not in high demand, and he didn't keep it in stock. However, he knew how to brew it and would be happy to make some if the adventurers could obtain the necessary ingredients. The only component he was missing was rot blossoms, flowers that grew only in the skulls of undead skeletons. This task was more dangerous. The adventurers had to venture into the cemetery and destroy skeletons to collect the rot blossoms. They fought their way through crowds of undead, gathered the macabre ingredients, and returned to Smith's. He brewed the zombie juice, a potent concoction that lived up to its name, and the adventurers brought it to Abercrombie. The old hermit was delighted, but he had yet another request. The undead in the area were becoming a nuisance, he explained, and he wanted to build scarecrows to keep them away. For this, he needed ghoul ribs, which could only be obtained from the ghouls in the cemetery. By now, Some adventurers might have become suspicious. The requests were becoming increasingly strange, the materials increasingly associated with dark magic. But Abercrombie's disguise was effective, and his explanations were plausible. Most adventurers simply completed the tasks, glad to help an old man and earn whatever reward he might offer. Those who did question the odd requests were met with innocent confusion. Abercrombie would shake his head sadly, explaining that the corrupted land required unusual measures to survive. He spoke of the difficulties of old age, of the loneliness of living so far from town, of the simple comforts that meant so much when one had so little. His performance was masterful, appealing to the compassion that heroes naturally felt for those in need. The adventurers who helped Abercrombie were for the most part good people. They were the kind of heroes who had come to Duskwood to help, to push back against the darkness that threatened innocent lives. The idea that they might be helping to create an even greater threat never occurred to them. They saw an old man in need, and they responded with the kindness that defined true heroism. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Abercrombie's scheme. He corrupted good intentions, turning acts of mercy into instruments of destruction. The adventurers who gathered his materials were not complicit in his crimes. They were victims of his manipulation, their heroic natures used against them. When the truth was revealed, many would struggle with guilt that was not truly theirs to bear. The ghoul ribs were obtained through more, fighting in the cemetery, each bone pried from the remains of creatures that had once been human. The adventurers brought them back to Abercrombie, who examined them with an expertise that seemed unusual for a simple hermit. He nodded in satisfaction and made one final request. While gathering herbs some distance from his shack, Abercrombie explained he had been ambushed by ogres. They had stolen a crate that contained important supplies, and he needed it back. Would the adventurers be so kind as to retrieve it from the Vulgol ogre mound? The ogre camp was dangerous territory, but the adventurers had already proven their capability. They fought their way in, located the crate, and fought their way out. When they examined the crate, they noticed something disturbing. It smelled strongly of death and decay. Whatever was inside had not been mere supplies, but they had committed to helping the old man, and so they returned the crate to Abercrombie. His eyes gleamed with an intensity that seemed out of place on his supposedly feeble features. He thanked them one final time and gave them a letter to deliver to Lord Ello Ebenlock, the mayor of Darkshire. The letter, Abercrombie explained, was for an old friend. He and Ebenlock went back many years, and he wanted to send his regards. It was a simple task, merely delivering a message, and then the adventurers would be done. But when the adventurers arrived in Darkshire and presented the letter to Lord Ebenlock, the mayor was confused. He knew no one named Abercrombie. He had never heard of a hermit living near the cemetery, and when he opened the letter, he found it written in an ancient language he could not read. The translation fell to Sira von Indy, a scholar in town who specialized in ancient texts. As she worked through the letter, her expression changed from curiosity to concern to outright terror. She urged the adventurers to take the translation back to the mayor immediately. The letter was not a friendly greeting. It was a declaration of war, a promise of revenge written in the language of the dead. Abercrombie revealed his true identity as the Embalmer, confessed that the adventurers had helped him create an abomination and announced that his gift would soon arrive in Darkshire. Lord Ebenlock's face went pale as he read the translation. He understood immediately what had happened and what was about to happen. The hermit had used innocent adventurers to gather the components for a monster, and that monster was now on its way to destroy Darkshire. Even as the mayor rallied the night watch, even as the adventurers realized how thoroughly they had been deceived, a terrible figure was rising behind Abercrombie's shack. It was enormous, a patchwork of corpses sewn together with rough stitches, animated by dark magic that glowed in its empty eyes. It had no will of its own, only the commands of its creator and an endless hunger for destruction. The adventurers who had helped create this monster felt the weight of their actions crushing down upon them. They had meant only to help, had thought themselves doing good, and now innocent people might die because of their kindness. Some vowed to make things right, to help stop the creature they had inadvertently helped create. Others simply stood in shock, unable to process the magnitude of their mistake. The messenger sent from Darkshire to warn the outlying farms barely made it ahead of the creature. Families grabbed what they could carry and fled, leaving homes and livelihoods behind. Those who lived along the main road knew that any moment might bring the abomination to their doorsteps. The panic spread faster than Stitches himself could walk. The creature's name was Stitches, and it was about to become the terror of Duskwood. The creation of Stitches was a masterwork of necromantic art, if such dark practices could be called art. Abercrombie had spent years gathering knowledge, perfecting techniques, and collecting materials. The result was an abomination more powerful than anything he had created before, a creature that combined the strength of many corpses with the dark magic that sustained them. Abominations were not unique to Duskwood. The Scourge had created thousands of them during the Third War, using the corpses of fallen soldiers and civilians to build monstrous warriors. These creatures were terrifying on the battlefield, their massive forms resistant to damage, and their crude weapons devastating to enemy ranks. But Stitches was special. Abercrombie had poured his hatred and his grief into the creation, binding the parts together with emotions as much as magic. The corpses that formed Stitch's body had been carefully selected, each one chosen for strength or resilience or some other quality that would make the whole more formidable. The creature stood nearly 10 feet tall, a mountain of rotting flesh held together by crude stitches that gave it its name. The stitches themselves were works of dark craftsmanship, heavy thread made from sinew and treated with alchemical compounds to resist decay. They held the disparate parts together through a combination of physical binding and magical reinforcement. Multiple arms jutted from its torso, positioned at odd angles that allowed the creature to attack in multiple directions simultaneously. Each arm was thick with muscle, preserved through necromantic processes that prevented the usual deterioration of dead tissue. The hands were large enough to crush a human skull, the fingers ending in nails that had been allowed to grow into claws. Its head was a patchwork of faces, features from different corpses blending together into a mask of horror. One eye might be blue, the other brown. Half a jaw from one body connected awkwardly to half from another. The mouth held teeth of varying sizes and conditions, some broken, some filed to points. When the creature made sounds, they emerged as a chorus of different voices, the remnants of the souls that had once inhabited the bodies from which it was made. The torso was the largest component, a barrel-shaped mass that contained the creature's corrupted organs. Abercrombie had chosen his materials carefully here, selecting bodies with strong hearts and lungs, even though these organs would serve a different purpose in undeath. The dark magic that animated Stitches used these organs as conduits, channeling necromantic energy through the same pathways that had once carried blood and air. The legs were thick as tree trunks, chosen from the largest corpses Abercrombie could find. They had to support the enormous weight of the creation to carry it across the miles between the cemetery and Darkshire. The feet were wrapped in chains that served both as armor and as weapons, capable of crushing anything unfortunate enough to be beneath them when Stitches walked. Stitches did not think in any meaningful sense. Its brain, such as it was, had been pieced together from fragments, and it lacked the capacity for reason or planning. But it could follow commands, and it had one overriding directive: march to Darkshire and destroy everything in its path. Abercrombie watched his creation rise with something like paternal pride. This was his revenge made manifest, his gift to the world that had taken his wife. When Stitches reached Darkshire, it would tear through the night watch, crash through the barricades, and bring ruin to the people who had lived their comfortable lives while he suffered alone. The necromancer gave his final command, and Stitches began to move. Its massive legs carried it forward with surprising speed, each step shaking the ground. It walked out from behind Abercrombie's shack and turned toward the road that led through Duskwood to Darkshire. In the original design of this encounter, the one that existed in World of Warcraft before the cataclysm changed everything, Stitch's journey was a spectacle visible to everyone in the zone. The abomination would spawn behind Abercrombie's shack after an adventurer completed the quest chain, and then it would begin its long patrol down the main road. The road through Duskwood was the primary artery connecting Darkshire to the outside world. It wound past the cemetery, through dense forest, past farms and camps, until it finally reached the town. Stitches followed this road with mechanical precision, never deviating from its path, never stopping unless something got in its way. And things did get in its way. The night watch, alerted by the adventurers who had realized their terrible mistake, deployed guards along the road to intercept the creature. 2 sets of defenders were stationed at key points, one near the Vulgul Ogre Mound and another outside a place called the Rotting Orchard. These guards were brave men and women, members of the militia who had sworn to protect Darkshire from all threats. They stood in Stitch's path with weapons drawn, determined to stop the abomination before it could reach the town. They knew they were facing something far more powerful than the usual undead, but they would not abandon their duty. The first engagement was short and brutal. Stitches crashed into the Night Watch defenders with unstoppable force, its massive arms swinging like clubs that sent armored bodies flying. The guards fought valiantly, their swords biting into rotting flesh, their torches scorching the creature's patchwork hide. They landed blows that would have killed any normal creature 10 times over, but Stitches barely seemed to notice the damage. Wounds that would have felled an ordinary enemy were merely inconveniences to the abomination. Its multiple arms, allowed it to fight multiple opponents simultaneously, crushing one defender while grabbing another. The screams of the dying mixed with the creature's inhuman roars. One by one, the defenders fell. A sergeant who had served the Night Watch for 20 years was torn in half, his final expression one of disbelief that anything could be so strong. A young recruit on her first assignment was crushed beneath the creature's foot. Her promising career ended before it had truly begun. A veteran who had survived countless battles against the undead met his end at the hands of an enemy he could not comprehend. The survivors tried to retreat, to fall back and regroup, but Stitches was faster than its size suggested. It ran them down, catching those who fled and ending them with brutal efficiency. Within minutes, the first defensive position had been completely overrun. Bodies and weapons littered the road, testament to a battle that had been lost before it began. Stitches continued its march, leaving carnage in its wake. Blood stained its arms and chest, adding to the collection of decay that composed its form. The creature felt nothing about the lives it had ended, no satisfaction and no remorse. It simply followed its command, moving inexorably toward Darkshire. The second group of guards fared no better. They had heard the sounds of battle from the first engagement, the screams and the terrible roars, and they knew what was coming. But they held their position, refusing to flee even when Stitches emerged from the forest like a nightmare given form. Without player intervention, both groups of Night Watch guards would be destroyed. Stitches would leave a trail of bodies behind it as it continued toward Darkshire, unstoppable and seemingly unstoppable. The creature was level 35, an elite enemy in a zone designed for characters between level 18 and 30. Most players who encountered it were simply not equipped to fight it. This created one of the most memorable experiences in classic World of Warcraft. Players traveling through Duskwood, often for the first time, would be going about their business when they suddenly encountered a massive abomination on the road. Most had no warning, no way to know that a quest chain completed by some other player had spawned this terror. The deaths were frequent and often comical in retrospect. A player might be fighting a spider or collecting quest items, completely unaware of the danger approaching. Then Stitches would appear, aggro the player from a considerable distance, and the screen would fill with the message announcing their demise. New players in particular were caught off guard, having no context for why a creature so far above their level would be roaming the roads. Stories of these encounters became part of World of Warcraft's folklore. Players would gather in forums and chat channels to share their Stitches experiences, comparing notes on where they had died and how many times. Some players deliberately completed the quest chain just to spawn Stitches, enjoying the chaos that would ensue. The shared trauma of Stitches' deaths created bonds between players. When someone mentioned that they had just been killed by Stitches, others would nod in sympathy and share their own stories. It became a rite of passage for Alliance players, a common experience that connected veterans and newcomers alike. You hadn't really experienced classic World of Warcraft until you had died to Stitches at least once. Some players developed elaborate warning systems. When they spotted Stitches on the road, they would announce it in general chat, giving others a chance to flee or prepare. These warnings saved countless lives, as players who received them could take cover or find alternative routes. The community that formed around this shared danger was one of the best examples of emergent gameplay in early World of Warcraft. Other players took a more aggressive approach. Groups would form specifically to hunt Stitches, waiting for someone to complete the quest chain and then mobilizing to bring the abomination down. These hunting parties were a mix of altruism and loot motivation, as Stitches dropped decent gear for its level. But there was also glory in the kill, bragging rights that came from defeating one of the game's most notorious enemies. The geography of Duskwood made the encounters particularly memorable. The dark forest, the perpetual twilight, the fog that limited visibility all contributed to the atmosphere of dread. You might not see Stitches until it was too late, its massive form emerging from the gloom just seconds before it was upon you. The zone's aesthetic design perfectly complemented the gameplay experience. The experience taught an important lesson about the original design philosophy of World of Warcraft. The world was not perfectly safe, even in zones appropriate for your level. Dangers lurked around every corner, and sometimes those dangers were far beyond your ability to handle. The only options were to run, to hide, or to accept death and try again. But Stitches could be stopped. If enough high-level players were in the zone when it spawned, they could band together to bring it down. This required coordination and effort, as Stitches was genuinely dangerous, even for characters above its level. Its health pool was enormous, and its attacks could kill careless adventurers quickly. When Stitches finally fell, the sense of accomplishment was significant. The players who had participated in the kill knew they had saved Darkshire from destruction, at least temporarily. The loot that Stitches dropped was decent for its level, providing some material reward to go with the satisfaction of victory. But the quest chain could be completed again by another player, and then Stitches would spawn once more. The cycle repeated endlessly, the abomination rising and falling, always ready to terrorize another generation of travelers. It became one of the defining features of the Duskwood experience, a rite of passage for Alliance players in the original game. The respawn mechanic added to Stitch's mystique. Unlike bosses in dungeons or raids, who reset on a predictable schedule, Stitches only appeared when someone completed the quest chain. This unpredictability meant that you could play for weeks without seeing him, then suddenly encounter him twice in one day. The randomness was part of the experience. Some servers developed patterns around Stitch's spawns. On heavily populated realms, the abomination was almost constantly active, as there were always players working through the Duskwood quests. On quieter servers, he might be absent for days, creating a false sense of security that made his eventual appearance all the more shocking. The relationship between Stitch's spawns and server population created interesting dynamics. Peak hours were more dangerous, because more players meant more quest completions, which meant more Stitches. Savvy players learned to do their Duskwood questing during off-peak times, when the roads were more likely to be clear. This kind of strategic thinking about spawn patterns was unique to the classic World of Warcraft experience. Some guilds made a game of tracking Stitch's kills and spawns, keeping logs of when he appeared and how long he survived. This data collection was mostly for entertainment, but it also provided useful information for players planning their leveling routes. The community created its own solutions to the Stitches problem, demonstrating the ingenuity that emerges when players are given genuine challenges to overcome. If Stitches was not stopped on the road, if no players intervened, and the Night Watch guards failed in their duty, the abomination would eventually reach Darkshire itself. The town that had survived so many threats would face its greatest challenge yet. The scene in Darkshire when Stitches arrived must have been one of absolute chaos. Citizens who had been going about their daily business would suddenly hear the screams, the crash of buildings, the roar of the creature that had invaded their home. The Night Watch would mobilize for a last-ditch defense, throwing everything they had at the monster. Lord Ello Ebenlock, the mayor who had received Abercrombie's mocking letter, would have been in the thick of the fighting. He was not a warrior by training, but he was the leader of Darkshire, and he would not hide while his people were in danger. Commander Althea Ebenlock would be there as well, rallying the militia and directing the defense. The town hall became the center of resistance, its sturdy walls providing some protection against the creature's rampage. Civilians crowded inside, praying to the light for deliverance, while the sounds of battle raged outside. The Night Watch formed defensive lines, falling back in order, trying to buy time for the townspeople. Stitches was not interested in occupation or conquest. It had no strategic goals, no desire for territory or resources. It simply wanted to destroy, to crush and tear and kill everything in its path. The abomination moved through Darkshire like a force of nature, breaking through barricades and swatting aside defenders. The creature's rampage through town created scenes of horror that survivors would never forget. Market stalls were smashed to splinters, their contents scattered across the cobblestones. A wagon left in the street was picked up and hurled through the wall of a building. The town's ancient well, which had provided water to generations of residents, was shattered in moments. Citizens who failed to reach shelter in time met terrible fates. An elderly man who moved too slowly was crushed against a wall. A mother who had returned for a child left behind in the panic was caught in the open street. The screams and the chaos blended together into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The Night Watch threw everything they had at the creature. Crossbow bolts studded its hide like pins in a cushion. Swords hacked at its legs, trying to bring it down. Fire was employed, torches thrown at the creature, and oil poured across its path. But Stitches shrugged off these attacks, continuing its destruction with single-minded determination. Some heroes emerged in the chaos. A retired soldier who had hung up his sword years ago retrieved it from above his mantle and charged at the creature, buying time for civilians to escape. A young mage, barely out of apprenticeship, threw fire spells that momentarily slowed the abomination's advance. A priest invoked the power of the light, creating a barrier that held for precious seconds. But these individual acts of heroism, while inspiring, were not enough to stop Stitches. The creature was simply too powerful for the defenders available. Without outside intervention, Darkshire was doomed, but eventually enough force would be brought to bear. Alliance heroes drawn by the commotion would join the fight, adding their strength to the Night Watch's desperate defense. Together, they could bring Stitches down, hacking at its massive form until the dark magic that sustained it finally failed. When Stitches fell, its body collapsed into a heap of rotting flesh. The creature that had caused so much terror was reduced to its component parts, individual corpses that had been joined together by Abercrombie's dark art. The threat was ended, at least for the moment. The aftermath of Stitch's attack was grim. The Night Watch had suffered casualties, brave men and women who had given their lives to protect Darkshire. Buildings had been damaged, livestock killed, and the town's sense of security shattered once again. The people of Darkshire had survived, but they had been reminded of how vulnerable they truly were. Lord Ebenlock ordered an immediate response to the source of the attack. A force of Night Watch soldiers and volunteer adventurers marched to Abercrombie's shack, determined to bring the necromancer to justice. They found the old man waiting for them, no longer pretending to be a harmless hermit. Abercrombie fought back, but he was no match for the combined force arrayed against him. His undead servants were cut down, his spells countered, and finally the embalmer himself was defeated. Some accounts say he was killed outright, while others suggest he was captured and brought back to Darkshire for judgment. Either way, the immediate threat was ended. The necromancer who had created Stitches was dealt with, and the people of Darkshire could begin the process of rebuilding. But the scars of the attack would remain, both physical and psychological. The Night Watch increased their patrols, and no one ever looked at a harmless hermit the same way again. The story of Stitches became one of Darkshire's defining legends. Parents told their children about the abomination that had attacked the town, using the tale as both a warning and a source of local pride. The people of Duskwood had faced a monster from nightmare and survived. They had proven once again that the darkness could be held at bay. In the taverns of Darkshire, the story grew with each telling. Stitches became larger, more terrifying, more difficult to defeat. The heroes who had brought it down became legendary figures, their deeds celebrated in song and story. Some versions of the tale claimed that the creature had been seconds away from destroying the town hall, that only the intervention of the most powerful champions had prevented complete disaster. The Night Watch incorporated the Battle of Darkshire into their training. Recruits were taught the lessons of that day, how the creature had been spawned through deception, how the town's defenses had nearly failed, how cooperation between the militia and outside heroes had ultimately saved the day. The story served as both inspiration and caution, a reminder of what they were fighting against and how easily they could be fooled. Lord Ebenlock commissioned a memorial to the fallen, a stone marker that listed the names of every Night Watch member who had died fighting Stitches. The monument stood in the town square, a permanent reminder of the price of vigilance. Families of the fallen would gather there on the anniversary of the attack, laying flowers and offering prayers for the souls of their loved ones. The attack also changed the town's security protocols. New procedures were implemented for dealing with requests from unknown individuals, particularly those living in remote areas. The Night Watch began more thorough investigations of hermits and recluses, though they tried to do so without harassing innocent people. The lesson of Abercrombie's deception was not forgotten, but questions remained. Where had Abercrombie learned his necromantic skills? What had driven him to such extremes of madness? And what had happened to his wife Eliza, whose death had started the chain of events that led to Stitches? The answer to the last question could be found in the cemetery near Abercrombie's shack. Eliza's grave was marked, and adventurers who investigated found that something was wrong. The dead woman had been disturbed, her body modified by dark magic. When confronted, she rose from her grave as a ghoul, attacking anyone who came near. Eliza had to be destroyed. Her cursed existence finally ended. It was a mercy in a way, releasing her from the hunger that Abercrombie's ritual had inflicted. But it was also a tragedy, the final chapter in a love story that had gone horribly wrong. The kindly alchemist and his beloved wife were both gone now, victims of the darkness that had consumed Duskwood. Those who witnessed the destruction of Eliza spoke of her final moments with a mixture of sadness and relief. In the instant before she was struck down, something seemed to flicker in her eyes, a fragment of the woman she had been before the curse took hold. Whether it was true recognition or merely wishful thinking on the part of the observers, no one could say. The grave was filled in again, this time with proper rites spoken over it to ensure she would not rise again. Priests of the light were brought from Darkshire, their prayers strengthening the barriers between life and death that had grown so weak in this cursed place. Eliza's soul, whatever remained of it, was finally allowed to rest. Abercrombie's shack was searched thoroughly after his defeat. What the investigators found there horrified even the most hardened veterans of Duskwood. The collection of body parts preserved in jars of alchemical solution, the notes detailing years of necromantic research, the tools of his terrible trade, stained with fluids best left unidentified, and everywhere the evidence of a mind that had descended completely into madness. The shack was burned to the ground, its contents destroyed, lest they fall into the hands of another would-be necromancer. The flames rose high into the perpetual twilight, a beacon visible for miles around. Those who watched said the fire seemed to burn with unusual intensity, as if the dark magic stored there was being released all at once. The site was eventually reclaimed by the forest, grass and weeds growing over the scorched earth. Within a few years, only those who knew where to look could find any evidence that a structure had ever stood there. Duskwood was good at swallowing its secrets, burying them beneath layers of undergrowth and fog. But the memory of Abercrombie persisted in the stories told around Darkshire's fires. The tale of the Embalmer became a cautionary one, warning against the dangers of grief allowed to fester and knowledge pursued without wisdom. Parents told it to children, Night Watch recruits learned it during training, and travelers were warned of it when they entered the zone. When the cataclysm reshaped Azeroth, many things changed in the world of Warcraft. Deathwing's emergence from Deepholm sent shockwaves across the planet, breaking continents and drowning coastlines. The familiar world that players had known for years was transformed, sometimes dramatically. Duskwood was not immune to these changes. The zone was redesigned with updated quests and streamlined leveling, part of Blizzard's effort to make the old content more accessible to new players. Some of the classic experiences were preserved, but others were modified or removed entirely. Stitch's role in the zone changed significantly. The old system, where completing a quest chain would spawn the abomination to patrol the roads, was replaced with something more controlled. In patch 4.0.3a, released on November 23, 2010, Stitches became part of a phased quest called the Embalmer's Revenge. In this new version, The encounter with Stitches was more personal and less random. Instead of potentially ganking unsuspecting players on the road, Stitches would spawn as part of a specific quest that players chose to undertake. The battle took place in a phased version of the area outside the Darkshire Town Hall, with Night Watch soldiers joining the fight. The creature's level was also reduced from 35 to 23, making it more appropriate for the zone's intended level range. This change made the encounter more balanced, but also less memorable. The terror of encountering a massively overleveled elite while traveling through the zone was gone, replaced by a more conventional quest boss experience. Some players mourned this change. The random danger that Stitches had represented was part of what made classic World of Warcraft feel like a living world. You never knew what might happen when you ventured out onto the roads, and that uncertainty created tension and excitement. The Cataclysm version was safer, more predictable, but also less thrilling. Others appreciated the new design. Getting repeatedly killed by an elite creature you couldn't possibly fight was frustrating, especially for new players who didn't understand why it was happening. The phased encounter allowed everyone to experience the Stitches story without the negative aspects of the old system. The quest chain leading to Stitches was also updated in the Cataclysm. The basic structure remained similar, with adventurers unknowingly helping Abercrombie gather materials for his creation. But the quests were streamlined and integrated more smoothly into the overall Duskwood experience. The story of Abercrombie and Eliza was expanded in some ways. The tragic background of the necromancer, his madness-inducing grief, and his desperate attempt to resurrect his wife was made clearer through quest text and environmental details. Players could understand why Abercrombie had become what he was, even if they couldn't excuse his actions. The Embalmer's revenge quest culminated in a direct confrontation with both Abercrombie and Stitches. Unlike the original version, where the necromancer and his creation attacked separately, the new quest had players face them together. It was a more dramatic climax, with the full weight of the story coming together in a single battle. When Stitches was defeated in this quest, the victory felt earned. Players had followed the story from Madame Eva's initial concern through all of Abercrombie's deceptions, and they had brought the threat to an end. The Night Watch soldiers who fought alongside them added to the sense that Darkshire had united against the threat, but something had been lost. The old Stitches was a force of nature, a random disaster that could strike anyone at any time. The new Stitches was a quest boss, dangerous but contained, memorable but not terrifying. The stories that players had told about their unexpected deaths on the roads of Duskwood became legends of a bygone era. Classic World of Warcraft, when it launched in August 2019, brought back the original experience in all its glory and danger. Players who had never known the old Stitches could now encounter him as he was meant to be, a roaming elite who patrolled the roads and killed the unwary. The terror returned, and with it the stories and the community that had formed around shared danger. The classic servers were flooded with players eager to relive their memories of vanilla World of Warcraft. Among the many experiences they sought, encountering Stitches was near the top of the list. Veterans who had played in 2004 and 2005 returned to Duskwood with a mixture of nostalgia and anticipation, waiting for that familiar moment when the abomination would appear on the road. For these returning players, the experience was tinged with memory. They remembered where they had been when they first encountered Stitches, what level they were, what class they were playing. They remembered the panic, the desperate attempts to escape, the inevitable deaths. And now they were reliving it all, a decade and a half later, with the same joy and terror. New players discovered Stitches for the first time, experiencing what the veterans had been describing for years. The stories they had heard, the legends that had grown up around the creature, were now validated by their own deaths. They understood why Stitches had become such an iconic part of World of Warcraft history. The classic community developed around Stitches in much the same way the original community had. Players warned each other in chat when Stitches was up, formed groups to take him down, and shared stories of narrow escapes and tragic deaths. History was repeating itself, the same patterns of behavior emerging around the same threat. Streaming and video content added a new dimension to the classic Stitches experience. Content creators would stage encounters with the abomination, filming their deaths and reactions for their audiences. The internet of 2019 was very different from the internet of 2004, and Stitches clips spread quickly through social media and video platforms. Some players made sport of the situation, griefing others by deliberately completing the quest chain and spawning Stitches at inconvenient times. This behavior was controversial but not bannable, as it simply involved completing content that was in the game. The social consequences, however, could be severe, as other players learned to recognize and avoid the griefers. For many players, the return of classic Stitches was a highlight of the classic experience. It reminded them where they had fallen in love with World of Warcraft in the first place, the sense that the world was dangerous and unpredictable. New players got to experience what veterans had been talking about for years, the sudden shock of encountering something far beyond their ability to handle. The two versions of Stitches, classic and retail, now exist side by side in the World of Warcraft experience. Players can choose which version they want to encounter, which memories they want to create. Both have their merits, but the classic version remains the one that most players remember when they think of the Terror of Darkshire. The story of Stitches might have ended with his defeat in Duskwood, another monster slain and forgotten. But the abomination proved more resilient than anyone expected. Somehow, despite being cut down by adventurers and Night Watch soldiers, Stitches survived. The first sign of his continued existence came during the Burning Legion's third invasion of Azeroth. This catastrophic event, which forms the backdrop of the Legion expansion, saw demons pouring through portals across the world. Every faction mobilized to face the threat, and even unlikely allies were recruited to the cause. In the Brawlers Guild, a fighting circuit where adventurers tested their skills against exotic opponents, Stitches appeared as a challenger. The abomination that had once terrorized the roads of Duskwood was now an opponent in organized combat, facing off against champions from both the Horde and the Alliance. How Stitches came to be in the Brawlers Guild is unclear. Perhaps the organizers captured him, seeing potential in his raw, destructive power. Perhaps he wandered in on his own, drawn by the sounds of battle. Or perhaps his survival was simply a testament to the durability of abomination kind, creatures that could endure injuries, that would kill any normal being. The Brawlers Guild itself was a secretive organization, operating in underground arenas in both Stormwind and Orgrimmar. Entry required an invitation, and the fights were bare-knuckle affairs that tested even the strongest champions. The guild attracted adventurers seeking glory, gold, and the simple satisfaction of combat. Stitches fit surprisingly well into this environment. His size and strength made him an imposing opponent, and his lack of higher reasoning meant he would fight without hesitation or strategy. He was a puzzle to be solved, a challenge that required understanding his attacks and finding the windows of vulnerability between them. The Brawlers Guild version of Stitches retained the same appearance as his Duskwood counterpart, the same shambling gait and patchwork body. But in the arena, he was contained, controlled, a danger that could be faced on one's own terms rather than as a surprise on a dark road. This made the encounter very different from the classic Duskwood experience. Some veteran players found satisfaction in finally being able to face Stitches alone, with proper preparation and without the element of surprise working against them. They could take their time, learn his patterns, and ultimately achieve the victory that had so often eluded them in their lower-level days. It was a form of closure, a chance to settle an old score. In the Brawlers Guild, Stitches retained his signature abilities. His hook allowed him to pull opponents toward him, disrupting their positioning and setting them up for his devastating melee attacks. His aura of rot inflicted damage over time to anyone who stayed close, punishing challengers who thought they could simply stand and trade blows. Fighting Stitches in the Brawlers Guild was a different experience from the roadside encounters of classic Duskwood. Here, the battle was contained, the rules were clear, and the challenger knew what they were getting into. But Stitches was still dangerous, still capable of killing overconfident adventurers who underestimated him. The abomination also appeared in a more unusual role, as a juror during the Brawlgar trial and the Brawl Pub trial. These events were part of the Brawlers Guild storyline, featuring mock trials where various characters rendered judgment on matters of importance. Stitch's presence among the jurors was presumably for comedy, the mindless abomination sitting in judgment alongside more articulate beings. Blizzard updated Stitch's model in patch 7.2.0, released on March 28, 2017. The new model was more detailed than the original, with better textures and more pronounced stitching. The creature looked more horrifying than ever, a fitting update for one of World of Warcraft's most iconic monsters. Stitches also spawned progeny of a sort. Battle pets named Stitches Jr. and Stitches Jr. Jr. could be encountered in various locations throughout the game. These miniature versions of the abomination were presumably created by the same necromantic techniques that had produced the original, though on a much smaller scale. Stitches Jr. appeared in players' garrisons during the Warlords of Draenor expansion, while Stitches Jr. Jr. could be found in Dalaran during Legion. These battle pets allowed players to have their own tiny abomination companion, a reminder of the Terror of Darkshire that they could carry with them on their adventures. The battle pet system itself allowed for interesting interactions with these miniature Stitches variants. Players could train them, level them up, and pit them against other pets in combat. The abilities of the Stitches pets reflected their larger counterpart, including hooks and poison clouds scaled down to appropriate size. Some collectors made it their mission to acquire every Stitches-related item in the game. They would display their miniature abominations alongside each other, creating tiny dioramas of the Terror of Darkshire. These collections became conversation starters, ways for players to share their memories and their appreciation for this iconic creature. The relationship between players and their Stitches pets was often affectionate in ways that seem paradoxical given the creature's origins. The same abomination that had killed their characters countless times became a beloved companion, named and cared for and brought out for battle. This transformation from terror to pet reflects the broader human capacity to find affection in the strangest places. For role players, the Stitches pets offered opportunities for storytelling. Characters might have acquired their tiny abomination as a trophy from defeating the original, or received it as a mysterious gift, or even created it themselves through alchemical means. The game mechanics provided the item, but the players provided the narrative. The continuing presence of Stitches in World of Warcraft demonstrates the character's lasting appeal. An enemy that could have been forgotten has instead become a recurring figure, appearing in new content and new roles across multiple expansions. The Terror of Darkshire has become a franchise within a franchise. Part of this appeal comes from nostalgia. Players who remember their early experiences in Duskwood, who died repeatedly to Stitches before finally learning to avoid him, have a special connection to the character. Seeing him appear in new content brings back those memories, connecting current gameplay to the past. But Stitches also works as a character in his own right. The concept of a shambling abomination, mindless and hungry, has a primal appeal. Stitches doesn't need complex motivations or elaborate backstory to be effective. He just needs to be there, looming and threatening, a reminder that the world of Warcraft is full of monsters. Stitch's fame extended beyond World of Warcraft itself when he was included in Heroes of the Storm, Blizzard's crossover multiplayer online battle arena game. In this game, heroes and villains from across Blizzard's various franchises come together to fight in team-based combat. Stitches was classified as a tank hero, using his massive health pool and disruptive abilities to protect allies and control the battlefield. His design in Heroes of the Storm expanded on his World of Warcraft abilities, creating a fully realized kit that made him a viable competitive choice. The centerpiece of Stitch's Heroes of the Storm kit was his hook ability. This skill shot would travel in a straight line and pull the first enemy hero it hit towards Stitches. The hook could cross walls and terrain, allowing Stitches to grab enemies from unexpected angles and drag them into unfavorable positions. Hook became one of the most iconic abilities in Heroes of the Storm. Landing a good hook could win teamfights by isolating a key enemy hero, pulling them away from their allies and into a waiting death trap. The skill required practice to use effectively, as missing hooks left Stitches without his primary tool for a significant cooldown. The psychological impact of Hook extended beyond its mechanical effect. Enemy players had to constantly be aware of Stitch's position, avoiding sightlines and staying behind minions or terrain. A good Stitches player could control space simply by threatening to hook, forcing enemies to play more cautiously even when the ability was on cooldown. Professional players developed Hook to an art form. They learned to predict enemy movement, to throw hooks at locations where enemies would be rather than where they were. They used terrain creatively, hooking around corners and over walls to catch enemies who thought they were safe. The highlight reels of Heroes of the Storm featured countless incredible Stitches hooks, plays that turned the tide of matches and decided championships. Slam was Stitches' area damage ability, dealing damage in a zone around him and slowing enemies caught in the impact area. This ability helped Stitches clear minion waves and deal damage in team fights, complementing his hook by punishing enemies he had pulled close. Devour allowed Stitches to bite an enemy, dealing significant damage to non-heroic units or lesser damage to heroes while restoring a portion of his health. This ability gave Stitches sustain in fights and helped him trade effectively with enemy heroes. Stitches had two heroic abilities to choose from at level 10. Putrid bile caused him to emit a trail of damaging and slowing bile as he moved, allowing him to zone enemies and chase fleeing targets. Gorge was even more dramatic, allowing Stitches to swallow an enemy hero whole and trap them inside his stomach for several seconds. Gorge was the more famous of the two heroics, creating memorable moments where Stitches would eat an enemy and carry them deep into allied territory before spitting them out. The ability could remove a key target from a fight entirely, giving Stitches' team a numbers advantage during crucial moments. The passive trait Vile Gas caused Stitches to emit poisonous clouds when he took damage, dealing damage over time to nearby enemies. This ability made it costly for enemies to attack Stitches, adding another layer of deterrence to his tank role. In competitive play, Stitches was valued for his ability to create picks, pulling enemy heroes out of position so his team could focus them down. A skilled Stitches player could single-handedly win games by landing hooks on priority targets, making him a high-skill, high-reward hero. The character's lore was referenced in his Heroes of the Storm portrayal. His hero description mentioned his origins in Duskwood and his creation by Abercrombie. Voice lines and animations captured the shambling, hungry nature of the abomination, bringing the World of Warcraft character to life in a new context. Stitches received various skins in Heroes of the Storm, offering alternate visual styles for the character. These included holiday-themed skins, alternative color schemes, and more dramatic reimaginings of the abomination concept. Each skin maintained the core visual identity of Stitches while offering variety for players who wanted a different look. The Chef Stitches skin reimagined the abomination as a monstrous cook, complete with chef's hat and meat cleaver. The Bikini Stitches skin was a comedic beach-themed variant that proved surprisingly popular among players. The Psycho Stitches skin gave him a more terrifying appearance, emphasizing the horror aspects of his design. These skins demonstrated the versatility of the character concept. Stitches could be funny or frightening, cute or horrifying, depending on how he was presented. This flexibility helped keep the character fresh and interesting, even for players who had been using him for years. Voice lines and animations brought personality to Stitches in Heroes of the Storm. His dialogue was simple and repetitive, appropriate for a creature of limited intelligence, but delivered with a distinctive gurgling voice that made him memorable. Lines like "Stitches wanna play" and "You look yummy" became catchphrases among fans of the character. The inclusion of Stitches in Heroes of the Storm introduced the character to players who might never have experienced him in World of Warcraft. For these players, Stitches was simply a fun tank hero with a unique hook mechanic without the baggage of memories from Duskwood roads. But for World of Warcraft veterans, seeing Stitches in Heroes of the Storm was a moment of recognition. The Terror of Darkshire had made it to the big leagues, competing alongside legendary figures like Arthas, Illidan, and Thrall. It was validation for a character who had started as a zone elite and become an icon. The success of Stitches in Heroes of the Storm demonstrates how a well-designed character can transcend their original context. The core concept of a hooking tank was compelling regardless of the backstory, and Stitch's visual design was distinctive and memorable. He earned his place in the roster through the strength of his gameplay. The competitive legacy of Stitches in Heroes of the Storm extended through multiple seasons and metas. When Hook was strong, Stitches saw play in professional matches, his ability to create picks valued at the highest levels of competition. When the meta shifted away from his strengths, he fell out of favor, only to return when patches adjusted the balance. Players who mained Stitches developed deep expertise with the character. They knew exactly how far Hook could travel, precisely how long Gorge would trap an enemy, the exact damage numbers of every ability. This knowledge, combined with thousands of hours of practice, allowed them to perform feats that seemed impossible to casual observers. The community that formed around Stitches in Heroes of the Storm was passionate and dedicated. They shared tips and strategies, analyzed professional play, and celebrated when their favorite character received buffs or recognition. For these players, Stitches was more than just a hero. He was an identity, a way of engaging with the game that set them apart from others. Even as Heroes of the Storm's competitive scene wound down in later years, Stitches maintained his place as a beloved character. New players continued to discover him, drawn by the satisfying feeling of landing a perfect hook. Veterans continued to play him, their muscle memory guiding hooks that newer players could only dream of. The Terror of Darkshire had found a second home in the Nexus, and he wasn't going anywhere. The story of Stitches is, in many ways, the story of World of Warcraft itself. The game has changed enormously since its launch in 2004, evolving through expansions and patches and complete system overhauls. What was once a dangerous, unpredictable world has become more streamlined and accessible, for better or worse. Stitches represents the original vision of World of Warcraft, a world where danger lurked around every corner. In classic World of Warcraft, you couldn't assume that you were safe just because you were in a zone appropriate for your level. Elite creatures roamed the roads, group quests required actual groups, and death was a frequent companion. This design philosophy had its drawbacks. New players could become frustrated by encounters they didn't understand and couldn't avoid. The random nature of spawns like Stitches meant that your gameplay experience depended partly on luck, on whether another player had recently completed a quest chain. The world was exciting, but it could also be punishing. The Cataclysm changes represented a shift in philosophy. The game became more predictable, more accessible, more respectful of players' time. Dangerous encounters were contained in quest phases or instances where players could engage with them on their own terms. The world was safer, but it was also less thrilling. Neither approach is objectively correct. Some players prefer the danger and unpredictability of classic design, feeling that it creates a more immersive and memorable experience. Others prefer the polish and accessibility of modern design, appreciating that they can make progress without random setbacks. The debate continues to this day. Stitches has become a symbol in this debate, a touchstone for discussions about what World of Warcraft should be. Those who love classic gameplay point to Stitches as an example of what made the old game special. Those who prefer modern design use him as an example of frustrating mechanics that needed to be fixed. Beyond the gameplay debates, Stitches has earned his place in World of Warcraft history through sheer memorable design. The image of a massive abomination shambling down a dark road, the terror of seeing it appear on your screen when you were just trying to complete a quest, the stories shared with friends about deaths and narrow escapes, these experiences have become part of the game's cultural heritage. The character of Abercrombie, Stitch's creator, adds depth to what could have been a simple monster encounter. His tragic backstory, his love for his wife, and his descent into madness, his manipulation of well-meaning adventurers, all of this creates a narrative that resonates beyond the mechanical challenge of fighting an elite enemy. Duskwood itself has become one of the most beloved zones in World of Warcraft, largely because of stories like Stitches. The atmosphere of the zone, its perpetual darkness and gothic horror themes, provides a perfect backdrop for tales of necromancers and abominations. Players who experience Duskwood for the first time often report that it's their favorite leveling zone, and Stitches is usually part of why. The zone design of Duskwood has been analyzed and praised by game designers and critics. The way the environment reinforces the narrative, the gradual revelation of the zone's various threats, the interconnected quest chains that tell multiple stories simultaneously, all contribute to a cohesive experience. Stitches is the culmination of one of these quest chains, the climax of a story that begins with simple compassion and ends with horror. The success of Duskwood influenced how Blizzard designed later zones. The lessons learned about atmosphere, storytelling, and memorable enemies were applied to areas like the Plaguelands, Icecrown, and Drustvar. These later zones built on the foundation that Duskwood had established, creating their own iconic encounters and stories. But Duskwood remained special, the original Gothic horror zone of World of Warcraft. Its relatively low-level range meant that most Alliance players experienced it early in their journey, forming impressions that would shape their expectations for the rest of the game. The darkness of Duskwood was often their first encounter with true danger, their first taste of the world's darker side. The music of Duskwood deserves special mention. The haunting melodies that play as you travel through the zone perfectly complement the visual design. The music shifts subtly as you move between areas, becoming more ominous near the cemeteries and more tense on the roads where Stitches might appear. Sound design has always been a strength of World of Warcraft, and Duskwood is one of the best examples of how music enhances gameplay. The influence of Stitches can be seen in other aspects of World of Warcraft. Abominations have appeared throughout the game's history, in the Scourge armies of Northrend, in the ranks of the Forsaken, and in various dungeon and raid encounters. But none have achieved the fame of the original Terror of Darkshire. The character's appearance in Heroes of the Storm and the other Blizzard content shows that the company recognizes Stitch's value as a brand. He's become one of the faces of World of Warcraft, appearing in promotional materials and merchandise alongside characters who play much larger roles in the game's ongoing story. For the players who remember encountering Stitches for the first time, the character represents a moment of discovery, the realization that the world was bigger and more dangerous than they had imagined, that adventures lay around every corner, that stories were being told even in the backgrounds of zones they were just passing through. Stitches taught them what World of Warcraft could be. And for those who never experienced the original Stitches, who know him only from the Cataclysm version or from Heroes of the Storm, the character still delivers. The visual design is striking, the abilities are fun to use or fight against, and the backstory provides context that elevates a simple monster encounter into something more meaningful. Stitches has earned his place in gaming history not through epic storylines or world-shaking events, but through the accumulated experiences of millions of players who have encountered him over the years. He's a testament to the power of good design, of creating memorable encounters that players want to talk about and share. The Terror of Darkshire will continue to terrorize players for as long as World of Warcraft exists. The legacy of Stitches extends beyond the game itself into gaming culture more broadly. When players discuss iconic enemies in MMOs, Stitches frequently appears on lists alongside creatures from other games. He has become a benchmark, an example of how to create a memorable, open-world threat that enhances rather than detracts from the player experience. Game designers study Stitches as a case study in emergent gameplay. The way his spawn triggered community responses, the social dynamics that formed around warning systems and hunting parties, the shared stories that became part of server culture, all of these emerged from a simple design decision: make a quest that spawns a dangerous elite. The complexity that arose from this simplicity is remarkable. The emotional impact of Stitches demonstrates something important about game design. Fear and danger, when properly implemented, enhance the gaming experience rather than diminishing it. Players remember their Stitches deaths because those deaths mattered. The threat felt real because the consequences were real. Modern games that remove all danger in the name of accessibility sometimes lose this emotional resonance. But Stitches also demonstrates the importance of fairness. The creature could be avoided once you knew about it. High-level players could protect lobies. The community could work together to solve the problem. The danger was real, but so were the solutions. This balance between threat and agency is what made Stitches work as a design. The merchandising of Stitches reflects his cultural importance. Plush toys, figurines, and other collectibles featuring the abomination have been produced over the years. Players who grew up dying to Stitches can now have a cute version of their tormentor sitting on their desk. The irony of cuddling with something that killed your character dozens of times is not lost on the community. The fan community has embraced Stitches in creative ways beyond official merchandise. Artists have created countless pieces depicting the abomination, ranging from terrifying realistic renderings to adorable chibi versions. Writers have penned fan fiction exploring Abercrombie's backstory or imagining alternative endings to the Stitches saga. Musicians have composed tribute songs, and cosplayers have brought the creature to life at conventions around the world. This creative engagement demonstrates the depth of connection players feel to the character. Stitches isn't just something they encountered in a game. He's become part of their personal mythology, a figure they've internalized and made their own. The fear and frustration he caused have transformed into affection and nostalgia over time. Online communities dedicated to World of Warcraft frequently feature Stitches in discussions and memes. At least it's not Stitches became a common way to console players who had died to lesser threats. Stories of near misses with the abomination are shared like fishing tales, growing more dramatic with each retelling. The creature has become a shared reference point, a piece of common ground that unites players who might otherwise have little in common. The academic study of games has also taken notice of Stitches. Researchers examining emergent gameplay, player communities, and game design have used him as an example of how simple mechanics can create complex social outcomes. His story appears in dissertations and conference papers, analyzed alongside other iconic gaming moments as evidence of the medium's cultural significance. Parents who played World of Warcraft in 2004 now introduce their children to the game, passing down stories of Stitches like folktales. The creature has become intergenerational, his legend transmitted from one cohort of players to the next. Children who have never experienced the original Duskwood still know to fear the shambling abomination because their parents have warned them. This transmission of gaming culture across generations is a relatively new phenomenon, and Stitches stands as one of its early examples. As games mature as a medium, such legends will become increasingly common, but Stitches will always have the distinction of being among the first. The Terror of Darkshire has earned his place, not just in gaming history, but in the broader story of how humans create and share meaning through play. As we come to the end of our tale, let us reflect on all that we have learned about Stitches and the world that created him. We have journeyed through the transformation of Brightwood into Duskwood, witnessing the fall of darkness upon a once peaceful land. We have met the Night Watch and the brave citizens of Darkshire, struggling to survive against threats that would overwhelm most communities. We have learned the tragic story of Abercrombie the Embalmer, a kindly alchemist driven mad by the death of his wife. His love became obsession, his grief became rage, and his knowledge became a weapon. The creation of Stitches was his revenge on a world that had taken everything from him. We have followed the deceptive quest chain that led unsuspecting adventurers to help create the very monster that would threaten them. Ghost hair thread, zombie juice, ghoul ribs, and a crate full of death, all gathered by those who thought they were helping a harmless old man. The twist, when the truth was revealed, remains one of the most effective storytelling moments in World of Warcraft. We have experienced the terror of Stitch's patrol, the shambling march from Abercrombie's shack to the gates of Darkshire. For players of classic World of Warcraft, this patrol was a defining experience, a reminder that the world was dangerous and that death could come at any moment. The stories of unexpected encounters have become legends. We have seen how Stitches changed with the Cataclysm, becoming a phased quest boss rather than a roaming terror. The new design was more accessible but less memorable, a trade off that reflects the broader evolution of World of Warcraft itself. Both versions have their merits, and both continue to exist for players who seek them out. We have followed Stitches beyond Duskwood to the Brawler's Guild, where he challenges adventurers in organized combat, and to Heroes of the Storm, where he hooks enemies across the battlefields of the Nexus. The Terror of Darkshire has become a character in his own right, appearing across multiple games and contexts. And through it all, we have seen the power of good game design. Stitches works because his visual design is memorable, his mechanics are engaging, and his backstory is compelling. He's a character who has earned his place in gaming history through the quality of his conception and the experiences he has provided to players. Now let the shadows of Duskwood fade as you drift toward sleep. The roads are quiet now, the night watch standing guard against the darkness. Stitches has been defeated, at least for tonight, and Darkshire is safe. The people of the town can rest, secure in the knowledge that heroes watch over them. Picture the scene in Darkshire as night settles over the town. The tavern lights glow warmly through the windows, casting rectangles of gold onto the cobblestones outside. Inside, adventurers share stories of their deeds, their voices mixing with the crackle of the fireplace. The barkeep pours ale with a practiced hand, nodding along to tales he has heard 100 times before. The night watch patrols the perimeter, their footsteps regular and reassuring. They walk the familiar routes, checking the barricades, scanning the tree line for movement. Tonight is quiet, but they remain vigilant. They know that peace in Duskwood is never permanent, only borrowed. In the town hall, Lord Ebenlock reviews reports by candlelight. The parchments detail supplies received and consumed, militia members deployed and returned, threats identified and neutralized. The work of governing a besieged town is never done, but Ebenlock attends to it with the same dedication his family has shown for generations. Commander Althea Ebenlock makes one final circuit of the town before retiring. She speaks quietly with each guard she passes, checking their alertness and their morale. The Night Watch respects her, follows her not just because of her family name, but because of her own courage and competence. Under her leadership, they have faced horrors and survived. The citizens sleep in their homes, their dreams perhaps troubled, but their bodies safe within walls that have held against countless attacks. Children curl beneath blankets their mothers wove, clutching toys that resemble nothing in the dark forest outside. The routines of daily life provide comfort, the familiar patterns of survival that the people of Darkshire have learned so well. Beyond the town, the forest waits in its eternal twilight. The trees stand sentinel, their branches interlocking overhead to block what little starlight might otherwise penetrate. The fog moves slowly between the trunks, sometimes parting to reveal glimpses of the road, sometimes closing in to hide everything beyond arm's length. The creatures of Duskwood go about their nocturnal business. Spiders spin webs across little-used paths, their silk glinting faintly when moonlight finds its way through the canopy. Wolves prowl the boundaries of their territories, their eyes reflecting green in the darkness. The undead shuffle through the cemeteries, their movements purposeless but unceasing. And somewhere, in the shadows, where even the brave dare not look, the memory of Stitches lingers. The abomination may have fallen, but the darkness that created him remains. One day, another necromancer may rise, another grief may curdle into madness, another monster may be born from hatred and despair, but that is a concern for another night. Tonight, Darkshire is at peace. Imagine yourself walking through Darkshire at the end of a long day's adventure. The eternal twilight is fading toward true night, the clouds above seeming somehow darker than before. The tavern windows glow with warm light, inviting travelers to come inside and rest. The sounds of the forest are distant and unthreatening, kept at bay by the vigilant night watch. You have earned your rest. The battles are over, the quests complete, and tomorrow will bring new adventures. For now, there is only the peaceful feeling of a job well done, of dangers faced and overcome. The World of Warcraft will still be there when you wake, but tonight you can set aside your weapons and your worries. The story of Stitches reminds us that even in the darkest places, heroes arise to face the darkness. The Night Watch never gave up, even when the odds seemed hopeless. The adventurers who answered Darkshire's call made a difference, even when they had been deceived, and in the end, the light prevailed over the shadow. Think of all the heroes who have walked the roads of Duskwood over the years. Millions of adventurers from every race and class, each with their own story, each contributing to the defense of a beleaguered town. Some came seeking glory, others seeking gold, still others simply seeking to help those in need. Whatever their motivations, they made a difference. These heroes form a tapestry of courage that stretches across decades of real-world time. The warrior who first tanked Stitches in 2004 and the paladin who faced him in Classic in 2019 are connected by more than shared gameplay. They are connected by the universal human experience of facing fear and choosing to fight anyway. The stories we tell about our gaming experiences matter. When we share tales of Stitches' deaths and narrow escapes, we are participating in an oral tradition as old as humanity itself. We are passing on lessons and warnings, celebrating victories and mourning defeats, building communities through shared narrative. The campfires of our ancestors have become the chat channels and forums of today, but the essential human need for story remains unchanged. World of Warcraft has given us many such stories. Stitches is just one of thousands of memorable encounters, one thread in a tapestry of shared experience that spans millions of players across the world. But his story resonates because it contains elements that are universally understood: love and loss, revenge and redemption, fear and courage. The darkness of Duskwood is a metaphor for the challenges we all face in life. Sometimes the world turns against us. Sometimes dangers appear that seem beyond our ability to handle. Sometimes the things we love are taken from us in ways that seem deeply unfair. But the story of Stitches reminds us that even in such times, we can find the strength to persevere. Let this truth comfort you as you drift toward sleep. Whatever challenges you face, whatever darkness threatens your path, you have the strength to overcome it. Like the heroes of Darkshire, you can stand against the night and emerge victorious. The Terror of Darkshire was defeated, and so too can your fears be conquered. Your breathing slows and deepens, matching the rhythm of your heartbeat. Your thoughts grow peaceful, settling into stillness like the eternal twilight over Duskwood. The tales of mad necromancers and shambling abominations fade into the background, replaced by the gentle embrace of approaching sleep. Rest now, brave adventurer. The roads of Duskwood are quiet, and the night watch keeps their vigil. Tomorrow will bring new stories, new adventures, new challenges to face. But tonight there is only rest, only peace, only the gentle drift toward dreams. Feel the tension leaving your muscles, starting with your feet and slowly working upward. Your calves relax, then your thighs, then the muscles of your back and shoulders. Let go of any tightness in your neck, any furrow in your brow. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort, deeper into peace. The sounds of the world grow distant, fading to a gentle hum in the background. Your eyelids grow heavy, closing naturally as sleep beckons. Each breath carries you further from wakefulness, further into the restful darkness that awaits. In your mind's eye, picture the forest of Duskwood transformed. Imagine the clouds parting to let starlight through. Imagine the fog lifting to reveal peaceful clearings. The creatures of darkness have retreated, driven back by the courage of heroes. For this one night, at least, the land is at peace. The people of Darkshire sleep soundly in their beds, protected by walls and by watchers. The night watch maintains its vigil, but tonight their duty is easy. No threats approach, no alarms sound. The endless twilight seems almost beautiful now, a soft gray glow that invites rest rather than inspiring fear. May your sleep be deep and dreamless, or if you dream, may you dream of victories and triumphs. May you dream of standing with heroes against the darkness, of playing your part in stories that will be told for generations. May you wake refreshed and ready for whatever the world brings, carrying with you the courage of all who have faced their fears. And may you always remember that even the greatest terrors can be overcome by those with the courage to face them. The monsters that seem insurmountable in the moment become legends we share around campfires. The challenges that threaten to overwhelm us become the stories that define us. The darkness always gives way to light in time. So say the heroes of Darkshire. So go your dreams. Sweet sleep to you. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the complete story of Stitches. If you enjoyed this tale of terror and triumph in Duskwood, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more content, exploring the rich lore and history of World of Warcraft. We have journeyed through 20 years of World of Warcraft history tonight, from the earliest days when Stitches first terrorized unprepared players on the roads of Duskwood, through the changes of Cataclysm, to his appearances in Heroes of the Storm and beyond. We have explored the tragic story of Abercrombie and Eliza, the resilience of Darkshire's people, and the way a simple zone elite became one of gaming's most enduring icons. The story of Stitches continues with every player who ventures into Duskwood, whether in retail World of Warcraft or classic servers. Each encounter adds to the legend. Each death becomes another story to share. The Terror of Darkshire has earned his immortality through the accumulated experiences of millions of players, and he will continue to earn it for as long as the game exists. We hope this tale has helped carry you toward peaceful sleep. Remember, even in the darkest forests, even facing the most terrifying monsters, heroes rise to meet the challenge. You carry that heroism within you. May you rest well tonight, and may your dreams be free of shambling abominations and mad necromancers. Until next time, farewell and sleep peacefully.